A good Wednesday to you. I'm T.Y. Chang from TYTI Investigates. I'm the climate change reporter. Today I'm going to be talking about something a little different. It's just something that frankly outrages me. And that is in Brooklyn, about a week ago, this has not been reported. It's just going to come out later today probably. An 89-year-old woman was set on fire by two teenagers. And the belief is, by the community leaders, this was a hate crime. Now, this woman, who's 89 years old, had just finished dinner in her Brooklyn home and took a walk outside. It's a Chinese cultural habit to take the evening constitutional after you eat dinner. She was 3 doors from her home when two teenagers began to slap her. Now, she didn't have her hearing aid in, so she couldn't hear what they were saying. And after they slapped her, they set her clothes on fire. That's the picture you looked at the top of this, where that was her shirt. And I couldn't show the whole picture, but as you go down, you can see the clothing has actually got holes in it from the fire. She was actually on fire. Now, they didn't rob her. They didn't take her jewelry. They didn't take any money from her. She had gold jewelry on. And then she struggled to get away from them and had the wherewithal to go up against the wall and put the flames out and go home. 89-year-old woman set on fire by two teenagers. You have to wonder what kind of hate is in their heart. She then went to the police department with her family. The 62nd Police Precinct house in Brooklyn. She was told, go home and call 911. So not only was she attacked by these two teenagers who set her on fire, when she approached the police, they ignored her. And this is one of the things they talk about a lot, is that a lot of the crime in New York City, which has statistically gone down until recently, a lot of people are saying that I've had police officers say to me that they had a criminal who was responsible for 10 grand larcenies, stealing things. And he was ordered to make it 1 grand larceny because it was one perpetrator, one criminal. But it's clearly before would have been listed as 10 crimes. But homicide overall is down. That you can't change. And things are better than they were 25 to 30 years ago in New York City. In any case, so this woman, who's Chinese American, 89 years old, the teenagers slap her, set her clothes on fire. And then when she goes to the police, they tell her, go home and call 911. Well, after a community leader got involved, the police then apologized. And they now have a task force working on it. They won't label it a hate crime, though, because they said because the woman couldn't hear anything, they don't think it's a hate crime. But you have to understand the context of what's happening here. In this neighborhood in Brooklyn, a number of African American and Latino teenagers have been stabbing Asian people. Stabbing them not with the entire knife, but the tip of the knife. Just so they injure them, but they don't kill them. People randomly walking by just suddenly stab and walk away laughing. This is according to the community leader that I spoke to. And the belief is, and it's actually been said, that the teenagers feel the Asians are pro-police, and therefore that's why they're being attacked. And the community leader believes this 89-year-old woman was set on fire because of that hatred, the belief that Asians are pro-police, therefore they should be attacked. The NYPD, clearly enough, up to this point, I think has been trying to keep it quiet so that nobody knows about it. The story will come out today, though. The community leader I know has talked to a good reporter. I'm not going to mention who he is, but in New York City, you'll know it, and it will be revealed today, and then it'll have more coverage. So the two kids who attacked this 89-year-old woman, slapped her, set her on fire, and then didn't take her jewelry or money or anything, are Latino. And again, in that neighborhood, there have been these attacks on Asians because of the belief that Asians are pro-police. Now, what's interesting about this, to me, that's very upsetting, besides that there is no justification for attacking an 89-year-old person, and that is that there's a belief that Asians are, this is something that's been perpetuated a lot, are the model minority, that this is the minority that get along better with the white establishment and establishment in general, and get attacked. But what's not understood is, in New York City proper, the poorest ethnicity is in fact Asian. The poorest ethnicity in New York City is Asian. Because what happens is, yes, there is the group, the model minority, those who are well educated and have good lives or middle class lives, upper middle class. There's a whole nother section of undocumented workers, undocumented Asians of many ethnicities, from Bangladesh to Chinese, who are undocumented, who are ignored by society and not seen as human beings even. And those are the delivery workers, the restaurant workers, before the garment factory people, the construction workers. They're not considered and thought as Asian because they're ignored by the society as a whole because they're not seen as human. Oh, that's just a delivery worker. That's not a real person. And that's, I think, widespread in society, that attitude exists. And I think that's part of what's fostering this. I'll give you another example in my field presently of climate change. Whenever you read about the climate change environmentalists who were very white before, who are now recognizing after Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd, that there's racism within the environmental movement, and that it has to be, we've recognized from the pandemic that Black and Latino communities are suffering more from COVID-19 because of the previous health conditions, especially with the lungs. But what's never mentioned, for example, is the Asian community also has suffered extremely. In New York City, for example, and this is where I live, so I know this better than other cities. I did an investigative story 15 years ago where the asthma rate in Chinatown, Manhattan's Chinatown, is one of the highest in the city, because more than 30 years ago, Republican Senator Alphonse D'Amato and Republican Congressman Al Molinari from Staten Island were able to stick into a federal budget bill at 1 a.m. a clause that said the Verrazano Bridge, which leads from Brooklyn to Staten Island, would be a one-way toll, only going into Staten Island with no toll going the other way. And what happened is that all the trucks leaving from Long Island and Brooklyn and Queens that want to go to New Jersey would now have double and triple the rate, up to $100-something, just to go across the Verrazano to get to New Jersey. So all of them were bypassed. Naturally enough, they would go through the free bridges, the Manhattan Bridge, onto Canal Street next to Chinatown to get to the free Holland Tunnel, which leads to New Jersey. And that increase in traffic increased the asthma rate in Chinatown to one of the highest in the city. But when climate change people talk about communities suffering under COVID-19, there's no discussion of Asians. And I think that's part of a national mentality in America that Asians are not really Americans, even though Chinese in particular have been here since 1848. I've met Chinese Americans who are 5th and 6th generation Asian Chinese Americans who are told to go home, even though they've been here for 6 generations, more than most white people actually. Any case, so I've seen this before. During the Civil Rights Movement and after the Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement, I've seen where there's this sense of who is the purest, who is the most righteous. And I won't use that term politically correct because I hate that term, because being politically incorrect means it's okay to be racist, and I'm not going to do that. But I've seen where people, on hindsight, I believe were actually police agents and government agents, infiltrate progressive and revolutionary organizations and divide them up by insisting on taking extreme actions. So what happened to me is over the years I've come to feel that in the United States, the best way for change is mass demonstrations that are peaceful. Because when it crosses into violence, in this country, at this time, with this economy, it's not successful. And it ends up dividing people. I would point out that in New York City, during the Black Lives Matter marches, there were huge numbers of every race, black and white and Asian and Latino, huge numbers, especially among the young. And that's a hope for the future, that at least the young will not be as racist, sexist, or homophobic as the older generations. In Portland, the Black Lives Movement, which is still continuing, unlike most of other cities in the United States, or more so, it's overwhelmingly white demonstrators who are demonstrating for Black Lives Matter. And this brings in the next question for me, our next topic. And that is this idea that, if you give me for a moment, I'm going to see if I can get the live chat up on my laptop here. There we go. When you start to have violence in mass demonstrations, what happens to that is that a criminal element then participates and gets all the attention. No community wants to have high crime, and no community wants abusive police. Every community wants what rich communities have, and that is low crime and respectful police who are not abusive and don't assault the residents. That's what every community wants and deserves. So I think it's important that in this time where we are confronting racism as it has not been confronted for decades in the United States, that we emphasize the unity that should be there and not emphasize the disunity and which community is not supporting us enough. I think that leads, I can understand the anger of people feeling that you're not on my side. But the reality is, to me, that violence ended up in the long run not working. Violence in 1968 led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. But the violence in Newark and Detroit destroyed those cities, and they never recovered. Peaceful mass demonstrations, although they're harder and take longer, also have longer lasting effects and have fewer negative effects in this country. We have the right for peaceful assembly. Well, we should have the right. We're supposed to have the right. At least it's written in the Constitution. Although some members of government obviously don't really believe in that. So I think it's important to understand, if the hatred or anger about the police is transformed into violence and crime and attacking an 89-year-old woman and setting her on fire, who's just walking down the street, has not said anything, and regardless, didn't say anything, didn't look at anything, didn't do anything at all, except walk by her house, and then you attack her and set her on fire? I may understand the anger, but I cannot condone that kind of violence. And I think that's very, that's my son, whom I talked to about this also. So, in any case, let's go to some of the, see if you have any comments about what I'm saying. And let's see, I've got, okay. Someone is talking about the air in Los Angeles. I'd really like it if some of you would also talk about an 89-year-old woman getting slapped and set on fire just because she's Asian. I'd like to see how you feel about what I said about violence and nonviolence and the importance of people uniting and recognizing that at least in New York City, and I'm sure in many other, I hope in many other cities, that it was large numbers of black, white, Latino, Asian, young people, and I'm sure in some cities Native Americans as well, marching in favor and support of Black Lives Matter. And that is more important than trying to say that you believe that, oh, Asians are pro-police. Because that's just not true. You know, what they are, I mean, just imagine what it would be like if your 89-year-old grandmother was set on fire just because of her race. For doing what? Walking down the street? Because you believe that other people aren't supporting your efforts enough? I can understand that anger, but I cannot condone that kind of violence. And anyone who would condone that kind of violence against an 89-year-old woman really needs to rethink what they have. RB says we have laws, rules, and regulations to protect the general population from being harmed. True, we have the laws, but they have to be enforced. For example, there are laws that say that if you're a police officer, you can't stop somebody for no reason at all, but it happens all the time, especially to black men. So in this case, this 89-year-old Chinese American woman and her family went to the 62nd Police Precinct House in Brooklyn, and they were told, go home and call 911. Now, why did they do that to this 89-year-old woman? Now, if that 89-year-old woman were the same race as the police officer, would they have said that? Or is there also a mentality of racism against Asians? And that we need to recognize that all of us who grew up in America, actually anywhere in the world almost, because of the entertainment media, that all of us have grown up with certain stereotypes about each other and have these certain racist concepts. And there's a lot of ignorance about each other's struggles. I'll give you an example. When I give speeches, especially within certain communities, I will ask, how many people know were killed in the Holocaust? Everybody raises their hand. This was at one of the city universities in New York. And then I asked, how many people know how many Chinese were slaughtered by the Japanese militarists during World War II? One person raised their hand out of an audience of 200. So the answer, I'd ask the people watching, do you know the answer to that? And the answer is 10 to 20 million, according to the New York Times. But do you know how many citizens of the Soviet Union were killed during World War II when the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, Russia, Georgia, Ukraine, etc.? And the answer to that is 22 million. Anyway, let's see what else they say. We have rules. Nobody's been here for a few days. Let us repeat video to mollifies yesterday. Best sound yet. Sound is great. Well, that's good. At least the sound is good. I don't know. Are they talking to each other about the sound? Let me go back a little bit. Okay, everybody in the chat is more talking to each other, but let's see. Okay. I'm not seeing any more. In any case, I invite you to try and address this thing about whether or not there's what's more important in any kind of progressive movement. I believe in Black Lives Matter, and I believe until Black Lives Matter, all lives cannot matter. But does that mean that gives justification for attacking an 89-year-old woman, setting her on fire because you feel that Asians don't support you enough? To me, the emphasis should be more on in the demonstrations in New York City. There were equally large numbers of black, white, Asian, and Latino, especially among the young, marching together for Black Lives Matter. And that it's important that that remain peaceful. And then, in fact, I think in a couple of demonstrations I saw not in New York City, but I can't remember which city it was, but there was a demonstration where some of the demonstrators became violent. And then some of the organizers of the Black Lives Matter demonstration actually stopped the violence, saying that this is going to hurt our cause, because that's all that will be seen is the violence instead of the massive protests. And that's critically important. In New York City, the criminal element came out. There were, and this is, I have direct evidence of this, indirect from people telling me this. They were in the East Village in Manhattan, and they saw white pickup trucks pull up in an organized caravan, 3 pickup trucks, vans actually, and behind them was a black Mercedes. They believed the person was directing them. They burst out, smashed all the windows, grabbed all the merchandise from cell phone stores, from high-end, bag places like the Gucci, whatever, and this was in Soho and in the East Village as well. And the person said within a minute she saw them, she had her cell phone on and she recorded. Within a minute, they were back in the vans and took off. And she took the license plate numbers and gave them to the police. I've not heard what happened to that. But that's organized crime. And by the way, those criminals were all white. But there have been now an increase in crime and shootings in black and Latino neighborhoods in New York City. There have also been attacks in Chinatown by some of the Black Lives Matter protesters, some of them, very, very small minority, who overturned vendors' fruit carts, some of the poorest people in the city, and set them on fire because they were available. That's out of control. And that's not going to endear you to anybody. That just hurts the overall cause, and I keep emphasizing the mass demonstrations are needed and they need to be peaceful. And then, the criminal element, and that includes people, taking advantage of the situation where they feel the police are weakened because the police are now correctly being told you can't abuse people. I've seen 2 things now. I'll give you 2 examples. I once covered a story that I was ordered not to reveal. It's part of the reason why I'm not at that station anymore. And then I saw undercover police. This was in, let's see, where was it? It was in Queens, actually. Queens, or close to the Brooklyn border. Undercover police stop a carload of young African-American men, get them all out. I saw them reach into their pockets and take out a wad of cash and put it in their pockets, and then tell the 4 young men to keep on their way. I had that on video, and then I was ordered not to use it in my story, saying that you don't know what actually happened. On the other hand, I also know, having talked to police officers, that when there was the street crime unit which murdered people and was disbanded, that street crime unit, when it was out there, a lot of both criminals knew they couldn't pack their weapons because they were being stopped, but also ordinary people who would get in an argument would not be carrying their guns because they knew they could be stopped. And they would say, you wait here, I'm going to go get my gun. And by the time they go to their home to go get their gun from wherever they have it, their family members and everybody, they've cooled down a little bit, and the family members are stopping them, and it brought crime down. The number of shootings went down. So you have a reality of deal. You have to deal with both. The ideal is to have low crime and respectful, non-abusive police, what every rich community has. Every community should have as well. So, I don't know why, but okay, I'm skipping that. You know what? I know why I didn't see that. Okay, let me go back. I had the wrong day up. So now let me go through this very quickly. And somebody thinks I'm a bit off with this one. All right, Khalida, tell me why I'm a bit off. Please scroll up and down in our comments instead of requesting us to do what we've already done. Okay, I will. I had the wrong, I'm sorry, I had the wrong day up. Okay, let's go back to see. Alice Murphy says, I knew about the concentration camps during World War II, but naively thought it was no more. I'm disturbingly unaware of things outside my bubble, but not anymore. And you know, in a way, there's almost no excuse to be outside not to be knowledgeable. Because a Google search, in 2 minutes, you can find out so much in a Google search. I'm not saying it's always right, but at least you can start a conversation. If it's not the protesters, then why are you conflating them? I don't know that it's not the protesters. I don't know who they are. I do know they've targeted Asians and saying that all Asians are, you know, are pro-police. I am pro-honest police. I am against dishonest police, abusive police. And I had somebody say online on Twitter that, you know, that all Asians, although persons of color, should not be considered allies of the Black Lives Movement. And that really infuriates me, because that's a way to divide people. And I've seen that happen before, where actual people I thought were police agents intentionally did that to try and divide movements. And I wrote back to that person on Twitter. I said to that person that I helped jail Medgar Evers' assassin, and I worked in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. So before you start saying that all Asians don't support Black Lives Matter, you should know what you're talking about. And that person had a quote from Flannery O'Connor on her Twitter homepage. And I said, before you put that quote there, you might remember that Flannery O'Connor regularly used the N-word in her personal correspondence. I never heard back from that person. Okay, let's see. I want to see more of the, I'm going back. Says we're being ignored. All right, I'm not ignoring you. I'm just going to now. I'm going to go back a lot earlier. Did someone from Black Lives Matter, Don Carlos said, did someone from Black Lives Matter set on fire? No, that's not what I'm saying. But the point is, there is a mentality there that has to be addressed. I mean, doesn't it outrage you that an 89-year-old woman would be set on fire? Any 89-year-old woman or person set on fire by anybody for walking down the street would infuriate me. Absolutely Black Lives Matter, but no violence. That's from Anna Hart. Well, that's what I'm saying. That I think there should be peaceful demonstrations, mass peaceful demonstrations, and violence in the long run. There may be a short-term result, but in the long run, it will have more damage. Ann Hart, kids that thought she was pro-police. Kevin Tweedy says, Black Lives Matter protesters did not do this. It was the police or agent provocateurs who were planted. Most of the violence was done by cops. Yes, most of the violence was done by the police in those demonstrations. I agree with that. But what I'm talking about here is in this Brooklyn neighborhood, there have been attacks on many Asian Americans who have not reported it. I only heard this from community leaders that I know and trust, who talked to me and trying to get me to get more coverage of this because they're saying that nobody's covering it. A lot of these people were afraid to come forward because they're older, and some of them are undocumented, so they're afraid if they go to the police. There was, among the criminal element in Manhattan 15 years ago, the word on the street was, you can rob the Chinese who look like they're poor because they're undocumented. They don't use banks because they don't have documentation, so they keep cash. And they won't report to the police because if they do, they're afraid they'll get deported. And that's a story that I covered, and that was something that was, once it was exposed, the police then set up a task force and did something about it. Jess, Weena agreed. We have been discussing this through this whole thing. Let's see. Amanda W. says, why do people assume Asians are pro-police? Okay. That's a good question. Now, are all Asians pro-police? Are they more pro-police overall than anybody else? Where does that come from? In New York City, there would be a reason for that. And that is a police officer who's Chinese American, Peter Liang, about, how many years ago was that now? That would be 4 years ago, was shot and killed, an unarmed African American man while he was on patrol by accident. Peter Liang, in my opinion, never should have been a cop. I've heard that from other police. He was doing what's called a vertical patrol, and I covered this story. I was there the next day, and he had his finger on the trigger of the gun, which you're not supposed to do. A gun that's loaded and cocked. He was on a vertical patrol with another officer, and when he reached for a door, his gun went off, hit a wall, bounced off the wall, and then hit the African American, Mr. Gurley, I think his last name was, right here in the armpit, exactly at the spot to then enter his heart. So this bizarre sequence of circumstances that, you know, first of all, Peter Liang never should have had his gun out. He never should have had it cocked. He never should have had it with his finger on the trigger. And it did hit the wall first, and then he heard something and went downstairs and didn't know that he actually shot anybody. Because Mr. Gurley, I think, ran down the stairs in shock because it was a darkened hallway. Part of the problem was that the New York Housing Authority did not keep the lights on in the hallway, in the stairwells. And when he went down, Peter Liang burst into tears, and then, but he didn't call right away. They didn't right away call for 911. So he did everything wrong, but it was not intentional. And so then 25,000 Asians and Asian Americans demonstrated outside Brooklyn saying this was a double tragedy, and he should not be, he was in prison, but he should not be charged with the higher felonies. And then the African American District Attorney, Kenneth Thompson, who died of cancer, he then actually did not file the heavier charges, saying that this was in fact an accident. So that would probably be the reason why a lot of people in Brooklyn would remember that and feel that Asians are pro-police. So, but if you believe an entire community is pro-police, does that justify attacking an 89-year-old woman who's walking down the street? And if you remember, and to me it's just like, let's emphasize the unity more, that in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in New York City, black, white, Asian, Latino, especially young, in large numbers, all demonstrated repeatedly. Okay, I'm going to move forward a little bit here. Carrie Firefly says, it's terrible. I think that all the violence is breeding violence, some stemming from police, but also others that are being led by such happenings, thinking it's okay to do, it's wrong and will. Kevin Tweedy says the real problem is money and wealth disparity. Biden will make that worse. Melanie Dennis says we won't tolerate it. Carrie Firefly says always that violence will always be wrong and we are supposed to take care of our older people. Kalita says everyone will make that worse, Kevin. 808 high vibes, great stuff. Manwish, if the entire community is pro-police, then the only question left is, was the 80-year-old pro-police? She's 89 years old, first of all. And since they didn't say anything to her, and plus she didn't have her hearing aid in, and just began slapping her and then setting her clothes on fire, I don't think they were doing a survey. I think there was an assumption. And if it's true, and I believe this because I've been told this by a community leader I trust, that a number of Asians in Brooklyn are being stabbed randomly as they walk down the street by black and Latino kids. They're not being asked, are you pro-police? They're just stabbing them. And the point is, it's taking away from the unity that was there at the beginning in the Black Lives Matter movement. And in fact, I've seen it happen before, I'll repeat it. I believe people who were police agents intentionally would do things that were, and in fact this is documented, that police agents intentionally committed acts of violence to break up the peaceful movements and to set people against, you know, the more revolutionary movements, the the civil rights and the anti-Vietnam War movements. That's actually been documented already. Kevin Tweed says, I abhor violence of any kind, but my wife and I have been threatened repeatedly and harassed by Biden supporters as well as Trump supporters. Well, that's wrong, obviously. And Kalita says, I would argue that the government's allowing people to live in poverty and then starvation is violence. I agree with that. But does that mean that because I agree that the government is wrong, that I'm going to go stab some random 89-year-old woman, not stab it, set a random 89-year-old woman on fire? Now, supposing this was a white woman, not an Asian woman, does that justify setting her on fire because there's a white power structure? I don't think that's the answer. I think, again, the answer is having unity, focusing on the unity that among the young people, especially black, white, Asian, and Latino, in New York City, certainly, we're all marching together for Black Lives Matter. And I think that's critically important. Kevin Tweed says, we are fighting against U.S. imperialism, Biden and Trump both supporting it. It's a dog and pony show. All right. I've said this before, but in terms of the climate change in particular, you know, Bernie Sanders talked about the Green New Deal, which is $16 trillion. It costs $16 trillion. I think actually that's what it's going to take to deal with the climate crisis. But I'm not an expert. But a lot of the scientists lean toward that certainly more than what Joe Biden has come up with is $2 trillion. To me, though, Donald Trump is like a negative $16 trillion in dealing with the climate. Reversing 100 his administration reversing 100 EPA regulations, allowing more fossil fuel leases on federal lands and waters. One thing after the other, reducing the amount of pollution that automobiles can emit, even though the industry was already set toward dealing with that. So I think realistically, if you're saying they're exactly the same, you're saying let's re-elect Donald Trump, because that's what's going to happen realistically. Bernie Sanders supports Joe Biden. You know, Bernie Sanders ran a good race. I think this time was fair. I think in 2016, in my opinion, it wasn't fair because of the superdelegate count, so that Bernie didn't have a fair chance then. I think this time, in 2020, he did have a fair chance. He lost, and he's now supporting Joe Biden. Whatever you may think of Joe Biden, the point is, I don't want to see, my opinion, Donald Trump reelected. Certainly in terms of climate change, it's negative 16 trillion if Donald Trump is reelected. But I'm sure that would be considered. Kalita says, TYT message, you're putting words in my mouth and I don't appreciate that. You asked about what we thought about violence and this is my input. Kalita, I just read what you wrote. Okay, but I'll read more. Kalita says, people always see violence as a physical attack from one person onto another. But my point is, poverty is also violence. And I said I agreed with that poverty is violence. But if I grew up poor, and I know a lot of people who grew up poor, that doesn't justify attacking an 89-year-old woman and setting her on fire. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I am saying that those two kids, though I understand what their anger is like, because I had the same anger, it does not justify what they did. And I'm going to read more. And that is not what. Okay, Kalita, I'm not understanding what you're saying. Type it again. You're undermining my point by doing that. Manwich says, this guy is good at expressing his ideas. Good work, guy. Melanie Dennis, sorry I got a text message and I thought I was texting on that. All right, I'm not sure what's going on there. But Kalita, say it again, and I'm going to read what you wrote again, and I won't respond to it so that everybody can hear what you're saying. But I'm reading your chat, and I will let you have the last word. But I'm just waiting for you to type something as if you haven't turned it off. Okay. So I knew this particular video would make people mad. I thought about not putting it on and talking about some climate change issues, but to me this was something that infuriated me and I thought was wrong, and I've seen it before in other movements, And I think it's something that we have to be careful about. Kalita says, as if, whoops, as if my point is not valid because an old woman, oh wait, oh, okay, wait. I gotta make it, I made it too big. Let me go back down. I promised Kalita I want you to read what I would read. Okay, here. Because an old woman was attacked, that's not true. Wait. Okay, here we go. I've got to scroll down. But every time I touch it, let's see. Here we go. Kalita said, as if my point is not valid because an old woman was attacked. But that is not true. Also, communities can also come together by getting the community leaders to come together. Yes. And try to defeat each other's stereotypes. Completely agree, Kalita. In fact, I've been encouraging the community leaders in the Asian American community that when they bring up this issue, that they also point out, because they're putting out a reward, a $10,000 reward to find these two teenagers who attacked this woman. I said, when you do that, I hope you'll also encourage donations that will support the nonviolent Black Lives Movement. In particular, a group I've donated to, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I said, I hope that you also say that we are going to donate to that, because this is somebody, the community leader I've been speaking to marched when Eric Gardner was killed by police. He's marched in every one of those demonstrations in favor of the African Americans, against the police. He's marched against the police in every one of those instances in New York City. And he said to people, don't tell me that because I'm trying to defend my community, that makes me anti any other community. But I completely agree, Kalita. The community leaders should be getting together, and they are. Some of them are. And Kalita gave me a smiley face. I'll give you my smiley face. Yes, I completely agree with that. That's what I'm trying to say, that when I talk about unity, when I talk about the unity in the Black Lives Matter marches in New York City, where I saw large numbers of black, white, Asian, and Latino all marching together, especially the young, that to me is part of what is the first step. And the second step is all these community leaders should be doing that. Al Sharpton said recently, he said that nobody wants crime. And I had a friend of mine say to me, the problem where he lives is that his teenage son is either going to be attacked by blue-shirted cops or blue-jeaned hoods. And that's a direct quote from somebody that I know. And he said, and that's the whole point, that every community should have low crime and respectful, non-abusive police. And I think that's a great idea, that to have the communities, not that they're going to listen to me, but have a summit. Let's have all the community leaders. And this Asian American leader I know is already talking to a Latino American district attorney and an African American, borough president, Eric Adams and Eric Gonzalez, and meeting with this particular individual that I know, this community leader, whose name, by the way, is Don Lee, and he's trying to meet with them to talk about what they can do together. So they are taking those steps. The same person who brought it to my attention about what was going on. And Jared Brown said, Cleto, okay, I accept what you say, even if I'm not seeing your issue just now. I accept it because I know you a bit. Okay. On that positive note, on that unifying note, I want to say to everybody, have a great weekend, be safe and be well. And I know that I'm going to continue to work for unity and for peaceful mass demonstrations to pursue justice in this country, as I've done my entire life. And yes, I think that's something that we should support for every community. Anyway, Kalita says, but really poverty is the biggest contributor to crime. Poverty does contribute to crime, there's no doubt. Because if you see your kids starving, you're going to do something about it, especially when there's nothing offered other than some criminal avenues. But at the same time, some of the best people I've ever known came out of poverty and did not go that route. And that's part of the problem. That the bigger problem is poverty, but we also have to take some responsibility. That's the secondary thing, Kalita. But in any case, on the positive note, on the unifying note, yes, the community should get together, learn more about each other, and understand. And I do acknowledge that there is racism among Asians against other people. But all I'm pointing out is no one seems to mention there's plenty of racism against Asians by other people. The attacks on COVID-19 in New York City were by black, Latino, and white people. So that, you know, all of us have some racism growing up in this country, and we need to deal with it and cope with it and be honest about it and work against it. Anyway, have a great weekend. Be safe and be well, especially you, Kalita. Take care.